Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thanks to my friends and colleagues in this House. I did note more applause on this side of the House than some of my friends in the government side. I know they've missed me because they've told me that in private, but it's good to be back here, Madam Speaker, because I still see a government relishing in patting themselves on the back. And that's after almost 2 years of a stunning display of broken promises. So much so that it reminds me of a Churchill quote that actually wasn't Churchill, but it's been attributed to him so many times that it's become part of his canon of quotations. And it reminds me of how the Liberals define success. They define success as consisting as going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm. And whether it's broken promises to veterans, to taxpayers, to exporters, to our farmers, they're seeing a litany of broken promises that have really hit small businesses in particularly bad, seniors and families who are tight with the dollar, and I've met many of them in the last number of months across this country, who are already feeling the higher tax burden, the carbon tax schemes being implemented across the country. So we're here debating a budget and a budget implementation. And as my colleague from the NDP so rightly commented, the irony of this debate wasn't lost on me. So I want to thank my Jamie's intern for helping prepare some remarks today, because I want to anoint a certain member of this House as someone that I will call the High Commissioner of Hubris, Madam Speaker, because we see him regularly. He's a nice guy. He's a friend to us all. He talks a lot in this House, and I'm going to pull back a few nuggets from his speeches in the past to just show the hubris of this government after less than 2 years. Why, Madam Speaker? Because today we're here and they brought in a time allocation motion, closure on this debate with respect to budget implementation, Madam Speaker. And let me show you what someone said a number of years ago in this House on this practice of time allocation. He said, quote, "Never before I've ever experienced a government that is so persistent in using time allocation, a form of closure, using it as frequently as it does." He goes on to say, "Why has the government House leader not recognized the value of sitting down with the opposition House leaders and trying to work through the House business in a fashion in which government would not be so dependent on having to bring in time allocation on virtually every piece of legislation?"
Who said that?
Do you know who said that, Madam Speaker? The member from Winnipeg North.
Oh, Kevin!
The member from Winnipeg North, who, Madam Speaker, is now the parliamentary secretary to the government House leader. Does he forget those comments from a few years ago, Madam Speaker, where he decried this practice? And what's ironic, Madam Speaker, this is the least ambitious government in the history of Canada. After almost 2 years, they've only passed royal assent on 19 bills, Madam Speaker. How many times have they introduced motions for time allocation? 23 times, Madam Speaker. So they've used closure, or tried to, more than they've passed legislation through Parliament of Canada.
Unbelievable.
Yet in the last Parliament, Madam Speaker, that member from Winnipeg North would howl at the moon if it was used. They're using closure more than they're passing bills, Madam Speaker. That's why I've anointed him today the High Commissioner of Hubris. Let's hear a little bit more of that hubris, Madam Speaker. What is this budget implementation bill? It's an omnibus bill, Madam Speaker. You know, the dreaded omnibus bills that the Liberals would go around the country saying the last government is destroying democracy as we know it. What did the member from Winnipeg North say about this type of omnibus bill? He called it, Madam Speaker, an assault on democracy. He went on to say it's an assault on the House of Commons, the manner in which the majority of the government has brought forward budget legislation. Mr. Speaker, now, I do feel assaulted, I would say, to the member of, of Winnipeg North, the High Commissioner of Hubris, Mr. Speaker. And yet again, the irony is clear. The last budget implementation bill of the Conservative government 172 pages, 172 draconian pages, in the words of that member, or the type of words he would use. What is this budget implementation bill, Mr. Speaker? 308 pages affecting 30 acts of Parliament, wow. Mr. Speaker. Where is the outrage?
That's twice as bad as what we did.
Where is the indignation from the High Commissioner of Hubris, Mr. Speaker? I don't see it. In fact, he's directing this right now in this House. Mr. Speaker, he is in charge of the record use of time allocation and omnibus bills that are approaching the sky in length, Mr. Speaker. I would note that there's a certain irony that the Prime Minister, just a few months ago, because the Prime Minister, when he does come, he answers a lot of questions. And I do note that he said, in response to talking about reforming and making this place better, he said, I quote, "I hope that future Prime Ministers will not make excessive use of omnibus bills and will not to resort to prorogation to avoid problematic situations." Well, the member from Winnipeg North should tell his Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, that they've used closure motions more times than they've passed bills through this House of Commons. It's almost a ridiculous record of failure, Mr. Speaker. Now, in some ways, as a Conservative, I'm glad they're so lacking in ambition, because they'd be doing more damage if they had more than 19 bills receiving royal assent, Mr. Speaker. So, why are we here? I have to also comment on the member from Kelowna Lake Country, Mr. Speaker, who he commented earlier in this House and then recited a bunch of things going back to Mackenzie King. He said, quote, "We're proceeding exactly how we said we would." And he talked about being conservative and all that stuff. What did the Liberal platform say with respect to budgeting? I'm going to remind the member from Kelowna Lake Country. Quote, "The Liberal platform, with the Liberal plan, the federal government will have a modest short-term deficit of less than $10 billion in each of the next 2 fiscal years. It goes on, after those fiscal years, the deficit will decline and our plan will return Canada to a balanced budget in 19 and 20, Mr. Speaker." Somebody should ask the member from Kelowna Lake Country if $28.5 billion is more than $10 billion. Because he broke his promise to the voters of his riding, Mr. Speaker. The record cuts to the Department of National Defense under his watch is also a broken promise, Mr. Speaker. So he is proceeding exactly how he said he would, I guess, Mr. Speaker. I said several times across this country, it saddens me profoundly that finance minister's own department projects they won't return to balance until 2055.
Unbelievable.
As I was across this country, I often said my daughter Molly is 10 years old. She'll be older than I am by the time their plan can get to balance, Mr. Speaker. That's a failure for a generation of Canadians, Mr. Speaker, at a time that the global economy is not in massive recession as it was in 2008, 2009. There's not a need for stimulus and growing every part of government. Yet the reckless spending means future taxes for our children, more taxes in the future for small businesses, and you've got to look at this astounding record. And I don't know how a single government member could defend this in their riding. They've raised taxes on families. No. They've raised taxes on small business. Terrible. They brought in a nationalized carbon tax. They brought in a payroll tax on CPP reform, yet the benefits of the reform will help less than 5% of Canadians, Mr. Speaker. They brought in an excise tax on ride sharing in this bill, Mr. Speaker. They're taxing sharing. That's what they've resorted to. They'll tax your beer, they'll tax your wine, they'll tax your income, and now they'll tax you if you're going to share. And so a government budget entitled the innovation budget is taxing and hindering the sharing innovation economy, Mr. Speaker. The irony is stunning. The final thing, in the infrastructure bank and this so-called Invest in Canada department, they're going to spend over $200 million on a department that is already done by the Canadian Trade Commissioner, and our new commissioner is an excellent Canadian and outstanding at her job. Global Affairs does that. Finance Canada does that. The government is already encouraging investment in Canada. We don't need an office tower and $200 million, Mr. Speaker. The investment the infrastructure bank, we don't need either, Mr. Speaker. We don't need Ottawa to build up another department of bureaucrats and more liberal appointees to build infrastructure. Canadians, pension plans, banks, we're doing it already, Mr. Speaker. I hope one of my questions will come from the High Commissioner of Hubris, the member from Winnipeg North.
Order. Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
I've sat here and listened to the opposition benches begging for the member from Winnipeg North to stop talking. I'm a little surprised now they wanted to continue. But I was most curious about this notion that this is an omnibus bill. This is not an omnibus bill. The previous Conservative budget, which was 640 pages, and the one before that, which was closer to 750, which had measures in it that weren't even discussed in the budget documents, had measures in it that were as far afield as selling embassies, as it had to do with the change in the long-form census was cancelled in it. We had issues that were just stuffed in there as if the ministers were instructed to find notes on their desk and stuff them into an omnibus bill and try and pass this legislation, regardless of whether it's a monetary impact or not. An omnibus bill, that was, but the promise we made was not to abuse omnibus legislation. I think all of us understand that budget bills contain all the measures in the budget and therefore are complex and often touch 30 measures. But I guess the question I have specifically for the members opposite is that he likes to quote Churchill, but I'll quote Stephen Harper.
Oh, that's dangerous.
We will not present a budget that isn't balanced.
No way.
That's what he said. No. Every one of our budgets will be balanced, and yet they failed to do that. And they didn't wait for the recession. They did it day one. Day one they did it. And then when the recession came, they really did it, and they never stopped. So the question is this: why didn't they ever balance a budget, and what advice would they give us that we would possibly listen to?
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was sadly a feeble attempt by the member from Spadina, Fort York, to defend the High Commissioner of Hubris, the member from Winnipeg North, because you know what? He called what's happening today an assault on democracy. And I'd ask that member, by changing 30 acts of Parliament through this one bill, which is more than twice the size of the first Budget Implementation Act he would have witnessed as a brand new member of Parliament after his by-election win, how can he possibly stand in this House and suggest that this is not an omnibus bill? You know, I always thought,
Liberals and truth don't mix.
He was the one that might not drink the Kool-Aid, Mr. Speaker. I think he's making it now. He could very well replace the member from Winnipeg North and be the adjunct High Commissioner to Hubris, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one of the concerns that I have with regards to the process through this bill that's been introduced, and I'd like the member to comment on a serious note about it, is the lack of due diligence that now takes place about legislation. And be fair, his government did use this process, and we did have a number of legislative measures that eventually ended up in the courts because they didn't go through the parliamentary process in the occlusion. Now, to be subsequently fair, this current bill has a lot of those weaknesses. So I'd ask him to comment on that and perhaps what exactly he thinks is going to happen to much of the legislation that has skirted proper legislative review, inclusion, and purposing.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Windsor for this question. As I highlighted in my remarks, what is astonishing about this government, you know, the Sunny Ways government that was going to do everything differently, they have actually used closure on more occasions in this chamber than they've actually been able to produce bills through this Parliament. It's astounding. The due diligence he's talking about is also not taking place where they said the parliamentary secretaries would not sit on committees and committees would be free to operate, and we see how they've used the committees to stifle debate. We see how some of their members will show up at a World Autism Day event to support the great work done by many on this issue, but our friend from Edmonton in particular, and then are whipped to not support that same measure. And I'm talking a measure, Mr. Speaker, and I think the member from Windsor would agree, $3 million at a time they're running almost a $30 billion deficit and growing virtually every department, creating new departments in Ottawa. Yet they're whipping the vote to do that. They're also the same government that whipped the vote for another great piece of legislation from another MP in Edmonton on a national registry for organ donations. They're whipping their vote far more than any government I've ever seen or read about in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, but they masquerade it in nice socks and slogans, Mr. Speaker. Canadians will soon learn the truth because it's now starting to impact their pocketbook, their jobs like Procter & Gamble in Brockville, Mr. Speaker, moving to the States. The reality, the sunny ways sunburn is already setting in.